And the first letter, which is not here on the slide, is very long and polite. It's sort of a lawyer's letter laying out the case for her admission. You know, this is what I did, this was my understanding, this is what the officials agreed to. And then she's apparently not at all content with that letter. She doesn't seem to feel that it's going to do the trick. And a few hours later, she writes the second letter, in which it has a very harsh tone, doesn't it? And she says, "Sir, you are or you are not president of the National University Law School. If you are its president, I desire to say to you that I have passed through the curriculum of study in this school and am entitled to and demand," this is her language to the President of the United States, "demand my diploma." Well, it worked. 2 weeks later, she had her degree. She's admitted to the DC bar. And so she becomes this rather unique creature, a woman attorney in 1870s United States. There are, by this time, probably a half a dozen women attorneys in the US. She has a clientele of working class people. You know, I asked students to think about this. Who would come to a woman attorney? There's never been any women attorneys. Would you entrust your work to them? And, you know, students say, well, they probably came because they were curious. They wanted to see what a woman attorney looked like, and I think that's true. And other people will say, well, maybe she had lower rates because she was a woman, and perhaps that also was true. She had, of course, by this time, lived in the Capitol for a good 7-odd years. And so she had cultivated a network of people. She had done what you all do in your businesses. And so she probably got clients from that, people who went to church with her, people who lived on her street, and so forth. She was aided by the daughter of her first husband, Laura, who stayed by her mother's side her entire life. I'm going to jump the chronology for a moment before I talk about her struggle to open the federal bar to women. In the late 1870s, early 80s, Lockwood noticed that the male attorneys on her street, she lived on a street which was kind of Lawyers Row in downtown Washington, and she noticed they were riding these adult tricycles. That it permitted them to get around town, to deliver their briefs, to do their business more quickly and efficiently than if you had to go around on foot. And she thought, this is for me. She was a very athletic person. She did calisthenics. And so she started exploring the purchase of one. Now, why was this interesting to me as her biographer? And why should it be interesting to you? Absolutely no woman rode a bicycle. It was considered a completely immodest thing for a woman to do. The whole idea of this physical activity in public, and I have another photograph that actually shows it, but one of the problems was that your ankle might show, right? And that was just considered totally risque. No proper woman would do it. And indeed, a few years later, President Cleveland actually issues a memo to the members of his government saying, you tell your wives, no bike riding. Okay. She used her legal fees to buy a house, and I want to tell you that because we've got to think about who she was in a moment in terms of how radical, how conventional. She buys a home, a row home, which is, I think, a statement of her middle-class professional status. It's not a great home in a leafy park. It's a row house, which she uses as home, office, boarding house. Later, she takes loans against it. This is the street later on that it was on. It was probably a somewhat less busy street when she first bought her home, but as you can see, it was not a grand neighborhood. It was a busy commercial neighborhood. It was a boarding house, and I always like to throw this in. Some of you who are really into politics may recognize some of these gentlemen. This is a house on Capitol Hill, the living room of it, owned by California Congressman George Miller, who today runs a boarding house on Capitol Hill, just like Lockwood did 100-odd years ago. And here you're seeing several other members of the House and also my senator, U.S. Senator from New York, Charles Schumer. All of these men commute, their families are elsewhere, and they board there. So what Lockwood was doing was something that continues in the Washington tradition. So as I said, we have to think about who she is. And on the one hand, I think we can say she was a conventional person, a wife and mother, a homeowner, a good churchgoer. On the other hand, she was a member of the most radical suffrage association in the United States at the time, Stanton and Anthony's National Women's Suffrage Association. She belonged to the Philadelphia-based Universal Peace Union, which was a peace group. Today we would call it a social justice and human rights organization. In her work on women's suffrage, Lockwood was very supportive of the movement to make certain that Mormon women who had been granted the vote by their state, the territorial legislature, did not lose it. There were men in Congress who wanted to take their voting rights away from them because these men didn't approve of the Mormon church. And they thought that that was one way of going after the church. And Lockwood said, no, 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 they have the right to vote legally and, you know, deal with the things that you don't like about the Mormon church in other ways. And she's lobbying a bill for women lawyers, which is also a very radical thing. And it's what I call her tougher fight. She has this very difficult time just becoming an attorney, but once she's an attorney, a year after she gets her diploma, because she's in Washington, she wants to start taking clients whose cases need to go into federal court. She has one such case. She goes to the court. It's called the U.S. Court of Claims. She has a male attorney standing there ready to vouch for her good moral character and to move her admission to the bar of that court. He does so, and the judges look at her and they say, "But madam, you are a woman." She said, well, okay, they have good eyes, you know. Yes, I'm a woman. And later on, they even say, you're a married woman. Well, yeah, there's Ezekiel sitting over there. And they said, the law says only men, and the legal doctrine of coverture says no women because you can't contract in your own name. So you could see why I mentioned that earlier. Lockwood begins then in 1874, another great struggle, another great contest with the government of the United States. She says, this is unacceptable. I see Lockwood as a great patriot. Right? She loved her country dearly, and she believed that the ideals of the country were very important, and that it was even more important to take ideals, like the ideal of equality, and make sure they became everyday, commonplace reality. So the idea of being barred from employment because she was a woman and a married woman was completely unacceptable to her. And she set out in 1874 to make that argument, and she had to make it, and did make it, for 5 years. Going to the US Congress, being rebuffed. Going to the US Supreme Court, being rebuffed. Going back to Congress for 2 years, fighting, being rebuffed, fighting. And finally, with the aid of these male allies that I was talking about before, some very important members of the House and Senate, she was able to get a bill proposed. And this is the bill. It's, you know, it's not pages and pages long. It's literally, when I first found it, I was like, gosh, this is the whole thing, you know? It seemed a little lame. Literally. The act is, no woman otherwise qualified shall be barred from practice before any United States court on account of her sex or coverture. They succeeded in getting the House and the Senate to pass this legislation in the winter of 1879. President Hayes signed the bill in February, and when the US Supreme Court came, this is the man who moves her admission, the court comes back into session March 3rd. This gentleman, who was a congressman from Ohio and then an attorney and women's rights supporter in Washington, Alfred Gallatin Riddle, moved her admission. I'm just going to go through this little